Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event. We're really excited to be kicking off our gender and sexuality workshop this year with a co-sponsor with Global Studies. So before I introduce the speakers, I'm Kristen Schilt. I'm the faculty director for the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. And I want to note that we're having another co-sponsored event with Global Studies on October 20th. We'll have an event called Manning Up for the Nation, State, Media, and China's Regulation on, quote, sissy men. This panel was organized by Yuchen Yang and Kate Fugazola, and it will feature a conversation with sociologist Yang Long from Berkeley and Yigi Dong from SUNY Buffalo. So we hope you can join us on October 20th as well, and that will be at 7 p.m. on Zoom. So today I'm very excited to have this discussion of the book Western Privilege, Work, Intimacy, and Postcolonial Hierarchies in Dubai with our author Amélie Le Renard, who's right here with me on screen. Amélie is a researcher at the Center for Scientific Research in Paris and is currently a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. So we've been really thrilled to have her. Amélie will be in conversation about her book with Rhacel Salazar Parreñas, who's a professor of sociology and gender studies at the University of Southern California, and the author of many books, most recently, Servants of Globalization, Migration and Domestic Work. And we'll be joined with Kimberly Hoang from Sociology and the Director of Global Studies, author of most recently, Dealing in Desire, Asian Ascendancy, Western Decline, and the Hidden Currencies of Global Sex Work, with a soon-to-be hot off the press book forthcoming next year. So I will turn this over to Amélie, who's going to talk to us about the book, and then we'll have a conversation with Rhacel and take your questions at the end. So Amélie, please.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. So I will share a PowerPoint presentation. I will just give you a quick overview of the book. We agreed on about 10 minutes, so it will be very quick. I just wanted to thank Kristen Schilt, first of all, for inviting me at the center as a visiting scholar, and I also thank you for organizing this conference with Kimberly K. Hoang, and I also thank Rhacel Parreñas for discussing my book. I'm very honored for that. So I will share my screen now. So that you can follow better, hopefully. So, the book is called Western Privilege, Work, Intimacy, and Postcolonial Hierarchies in Dubai. First of all, the project of the book is a postcolonial feminist perspective on Western privilege in Dubai, and it came from my experience while I was doing my PhD before on gender issues in Saudi Arabia, and met French people there that had discourses that shocked me about Saudis, and so I really wanted to analyze this Western status in the Gulf, and so I began working on this in Dubai. So that's how it began. I'm a sociologist, and the book is based on 98 interviews with 77 Western passport holders and 21 people having so-called skilled jobs. So-called because I'm also analyzing this category of skilled and unskilled, and no Western passports, so I could compare a little bit. I also re-interviewed 17 of them several years after our first interview to see where they went and if they were still in Dubai, etc. So I will talk about three main ideas of the book, or main projects of the book. So first, the book analyzes how privilege is constructed through work and intimacy. Second, it shows how whiteness and Westernness interact. And third, it it tries to go beyond an exceptionalist vision of Dubai. So first of all, how privilege is constructed through work and intimacy. So in the book, I analyze Westerners' structural advantages on the job market, like higher salaries, positions, etc. And I analyze how skills on Dubai's job market are constructed as Western. Most people I met legitimized this racialized hierarchy and naturalized it as a consequence of neoliberalism. They also participated in reproducing it, for instance, when they recruited people. So I just quote you two interviews, one with a Libyan engineer that I called Naima in the book. So she told me, Westerners, they even get salary compensations for their pets. And another one is an interview with Mike, a white architect with US nationality, who told, okay, it's very racist quote, so I quote it now. The Egyptians don't have the same quality of training. In the US, to become an architect, you have to pass exams, take courses. It's really very hard. Here, everybody's an architect overnight, just like that. And then Egyptians hide things. They're not straightforward about things. They never want to take responsibility for decision making, etc. So it gives you an example of how skills are racialized on Dubai's job market, and it was very, very central in my interviews. But benefits associated with Western passport also differ depending on social position, especially in terms of gender, class, and race. And Westerners are expected to perform a stereotypical Westerness, which implies a specific bodily and emotional work that is also gendered and racialized. So beside professional aspects, Western distinction lies on specific forms of heteronormativity. Dubai's biopolitics differentiates migrants' intimacies. So, for instance, Philippe, a French white interviewee, told me, if we hadn't been here, we never would have had a third child. And Marie, an independent part-time worker, white French, told me, it was very tempting for a mom with a second child to come here where we can find domestic help. So it's just to suggest the analysis of biopolitics that can be made about Dubai, and that is not, I think, exceptional to Dubai. Most interviewees identify with heteronormativity imaginaries of Westernness. On the one hand, Western white upper class couples, in spite of a clear labor division among spouses, identify with gender equality and women's emancipation, in contrast with others represented as sexist, oppressed, or as frustrated sexual predators. On the other hand, single Westerners often long for serious, authentic relations, which they present as impossible in Dubai. Many associate authentic love with the West and Westerners, in contrast with Dubai's so-called materialism and superficiality. So second, I wanted to say a word about another central question of the book, which is how whiteness and Westernness interact. So the book studies how white and non-white Western residents embody privilege depending on their trajectories and experiences of racialization. Dubai's promise of inclusion is limited and precarious for Dubai's non-white Western residents, especially on the medium term, but many still experience Dubai as emancipatory compared to their home societies. And it was very interesting to hear these accounts of migration. So most of my interviews were with French people in this regard, but I also used blogs by US American people to show that it's not only people from France who who have this feeling of that Dubai is less racist than their home societies, but it also comes from people who lived, who were born and raised in other societies. So it was, for instance, about security and not feeling threatened by the police, as showed the extract of the interview with Janelle. I don't have to worry about my Black husband being racially profiled or being shot for simply being who we are. Life here is stress-free. So another interviewee, Linda, who was French and who identified as Muslim, also told me what I love about Dubai, all the comfort, beyond all the comfort you have here, is the fact that I've never seen anywhere else where you can see walking practically side by side a Russian woman in mini shorts and a tank top and an Emirati woman completely covered by her burqa. So it's more a discourse about Islamophobia in Western countries and tolerance in Dubai. Though I also analyze forms of like Islamophobia on Dubai's job market, it's not absent. And another element that really marked me in the interviews is the way in which people told their intergenerational histories of migration, like Sana when she said, our parents came to France to have a better life, and we are leaving France to have a better life. So it's also this kind of comparison that was very interesting to analyze. And so how whiteness and Westernness interact. The book shows that whiteness is definitely an overprivileged status compared to Westernness. And it shows how different people appropriate discourses on Dubai as a place where life is easy and so on, depending on their trajectories in terms of race and class, and also gender, because there's also a discourse about gender and security in Dubai that is interesting to analyze. So a third central idea is to go beyond the exceptionalist discourse on Dubai. And this is also like this aspect of the book was really constructed in discussions with colleagues that also work on the Arabian Peninsula, Ahmed Kanna and Nea Vora. And like the discussions between us really helped me for this aspect of the book. So the book participates in a post-colonial and reflexive turn in studies of the Arabian Peninsula. And the book shows that the exceptionalist discourse on Dubai as an exceptionally unfair social order is very situated. And in the book, it's like among my interviewees, many white people from upper and middle classes consider Dubai as a very unfair social space, while being dominant in this social order. And they really idealize Western societies as fair societies and equal societies where there is gender equality and rights for workers and so on. And other people actually did not have this discourse. Other people were more like comparing, for instance, structural racism in Dubai and structural racism in France or in the US. So, so it's an aspect of the book to also look at how the representations of Dubai participate in the construction of Western subjectivities that are distinctive and yeah. So this also helps me to argue that Westerners are not outsiders to Dubai's social order. They impact who gets hired, the amounts of salaries, etc. And they sponsor and hire domestic workers. So they're like the representations that many people have of themselves as outsiders to Dubai also participate in the construction of their Western subjectivities as people who don't really belong to Dubai and who can judge Dubai from the outside and so on, rather than as people who are dominant in this social order and hire people and decide the amount of salaries, etc. So I think Dubai is a very interesting place to study both like global racial capitalism and neoliberal biopolitics, and how like different groups of people are constructed and how hierarchy is produced, touching like both the job market and the more intimate aspects of life, such as being able to have one's children or not, being able to move freely in a city or not, etc. So the idea is really to take it as a very interesting node to study these global circulations and power hierarchies. So I just stop here, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Great. Rhacel, please come on in. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a logistical question. Do I just comment, or do we have a conversation, or do I just pose a series of questions?
I think conversation is probably great. Like, I think that's probably easier and more fun.
Okay. Okay, so I'm also mindful of, I'm assuming a lot of the people in the audience are PhD students. And so with that in mind, with them in mind as the audience, I wanted to ask about, or talk about the accessibility of doing research in the region, which is something that you didn't really talk about in the book. And so I was very curious about that. I recently returned to the field, Dubai, after having published a few papers. And one of the papers I published, I really wish my co-author didn't give it this title. And I think we called it like Refusing Neo-Slavery in Dubai, or UAE. And so that is like a signal that I feel like the government will tag me. And so there's so many scholars who have been denied entry or deported while they were doing research. And so the people I'm thinking about first is Syed Ali, who was actually just studying middle-class Global South professionals. And during his last day in the field, before he was about 24 hours before he was going to board his airplane, the secret police came to his house and interrogated him for nearly 24 hours and then confiscated his computer or wiped it out. Another colleague, Lavi Katheravalu, who wrote a book on construction workers that was published by Palgrave, and she was telling me she assumed no one ever bought her $113 book. When she tried to re-enter the field, they denied her entry. And so we know of, you know, the guy, the British guy, right, because he was doing security studies, and so that's more understandable. So when I was in the field, I went to the Ministry of Interior to let them know I existed, because I didn't want to get, you know, sort of deported, like when I'm close to finishing. I wanted them to basically bar me from doing research from the beginning, but that was like never an issue. So then my question is, as a Westerner, not doing security studies, I want to know if you ever felt like having to negotiate or being in the field, hiding, like other researchers feel that they had to.
Yeah, thank you for this question. So I think I kind of took bad habits because I did my PhD about Saudi Arabia. And so, yeah, when I was in Saudi Arabia, it was a very, very, very challenging aspect. I always had very difficult time. Like I had many difficulties getting my visas to go there. I was threatened by people that told me that they would get me out of the country. I mean, I had several problems, but I still went there like a lot for many years. And so part of like, when I finished my PhD, I was really happy to work on a country which I assumed would be more simple, but it's not. Like Dubai is not more simple, and it's also really a stereotype and a bad representation of this place. But like the thing that is simple is that when you have a Western passport, you can enter without a visa, which makes a huge difference compared to Saudi Arabia. And so I did my whole field work without having research visa. I did everything on tourist visa, and I never asked any permission from anyone because my experience, yeah, so it's complicated also because I'm based in France. So at the time I did not have to, for instance, to defend this in front of institutions and so on, because it could be also complicated because of this. I mean, doing research without having the authorization of the country where you are doing research. So yes, but that's how I did it. I mean, so that's how I did it. Now the problem is that I don't feel I could go back there. Yeah.
Why don't you feel you can go back there?
Because I'm not sure, and I don't want to take the risk of being arrested. So, okay. But maybe I would. I mean, maybe nothing would happen, and maybe I would just not get. Maybe they wouldn't let me in. I mean,
it's interesting because when I went back in the field not so long ago, I remember I kept on talking to myself in the airport saying, oh my God, please let me in, please let me in, please let me in. Because I was really worried that I was already like earmarked as someone that was going to be denied entry, just because I have colleagues who were denied entry, at the airport. And it kind of was like a not pleasant experience having to just sit there. And so my last question about this before we move on then is, what advice would you give PhD students who are aspiring to, not study the like historical stuff about the region, but study the everyday experiences of people in the region? An anthropologist, for example, going there, what would you tell PhD students today?
You mean if it's safe or not and so on? I think it's, I think it's safe, and it depends on your subjects. And I think it's the fact of publishing that makes it complicated. But I mean, I think we are all, we don't know where is the limit and where is the red line. So that's the tricky thing, like you never know. And for Saudi Arabia, it was the same, because sometimes I got my visa. I mean, I did not get my visa. My demand was rejected. So I took it personally, but then when I talked with people from the French embassy, they told, oh no, it's just like right now they are not happy with French people and so on. So you never really know, and it's the difficult thing. But I think once you have published, I mean, I would say also really listen to your limits, and it's not only about visa issues and so on. I think I did things in the field work that I would not do right now, and yes, I think when you are a PhD student, sometimes you are encouraged to not really take your limits into account because you really want to do a real field work and be a real anthropologist or a real sociologist and so on. But in fact, like, people should really listen to their own red lines also. So maybe that's the advice I would give, like, listen to yourself and to your own limits.
Yeah. So, okay, so moving on to the content of the book. So first, congratulations on finishing this. And as we just sort of suggested, it is quite hard to do research in that region for many, reasons, one being getting sort of arrested and then kicked out. But this book, what I really saw as really showing the different status hierarchies of this particular, group of like foreigners in this country. And so you start the book by saying that what really shapes people's experiences is their visa, or not their visa, their labor contract, right? Which I thought was really revealing. And so there's like three kinds. So you had three categories of labor contracts. So the first labor contract is that expat one, the one that's like the corporate one, the one where your corporation recruits you, sends you, deploys you there, and you get a lot of perks for that. It's kind of known as that expat contract, where you would get like free housing, certain kind of like bonus pay, et cetera, et cetera. All your kids' tuition is going to be paid for, right? So then there's the second one where they're locally hired, right? But by a multinational corporation, and then they get some perks, but not as much as those who were like deployed there. And then the third, as you talked about in your book in the introduction, is the labor contract, where they're just hired locally, probably not like a huge multinational firm like Google, but like a smaller firm. And so the contract and the kind of contract people have really kind of shapes their experiences, the kinds of salaries they're likely to get, the kinds of perks that they're likely to get, and from the salary that they will get, then the kinds of state benefits, how citizenship is really shaped by this. So I was so excited when you're reading it, but then I was reading when you sort of set up the intro talking about this, but then as I was reading the book, you kind of just dropped it. So then I was so surprised, and I really actually wanted to know more about how the contract categorizes people and really shapes then the citizenship of a Westerner within this space, right? Because the economic benefits that they get really is tied to the contract. And I think this is so important in, I think it's like hard to, if you're not familiar with the region, it's like hard to kind of fathom then, how do people make status hierarchies? How do people distinguish themselves from each other? So in this place where, Westerners are kind of this amorphous group, right? And they all have the sort of similar visa. This is before that 10-year golden visa, right? The special people. So this is not really in your book, but we don't really have to talk about that. But that's also interesting about a different status distinction then that people have. So I wanted to ask you to, I wanted to push you to talk a little bit more about how, what really distinguishes like the three different groups, right? And who's likely to be in the three different groups, and does the contract of a person determine how they relate with one another? So with that last question is sort of what I'll qualify that a bit. So when I was in Japan, doing field work there, when I met Filipinos, they always asked me, what is your visa, right? And so then it was like they would tag you, and it was basically like, are you under this hostess visa or are you a spousal visa? And it was really kind of the visa shaped how people saw each other. So my visa was neither. So they didn't know what to do with me because my visa was as a professional, right? And so they were kind of like, I was just not even I was not legible to them. So I'm just wondering then the contract, how the contract then shapes people's interactions with one another.
I would say, I mean, the two groups I really tried to differentiate in the book are what I called guest families and I think single residents. I can't remember how I called them, the second group, but but so the contract, the influence of the contract is huge. But for me, the main question is whether you have what they call a family package or not, because because some contracts are just, you know, a normal, I don't know, for me normal labor contracts. I mean, you have your job, you have your salary, that's it. But some of them are really contracts with a lot of other advantages. And so this is both expatriate contracts and some local contracts that actually, I think, are inspired from expatriate contracts. So these contracts are mainly contracts for white men, and they actually condition the lives of also their families, because their families come under these contracts, but not as employed, you know. So, for instance, they get a villa, the rent of the villa. They get international fees for fees for their for the international schooling of their children, insurance, and so on. So they get many advantages. And so for me, it's very important because first it makes like white men are like expatriate white men or white men who have this kind of very advantageous local contracts are an overprivileged group inside this privileged group. It also means that they have specific models of heterosexuality because most of the time they come with wives that are dependent and that don't have a working contract. That, like, some of them take independent part-time jobs, but they don't have like full-time jobs. And also it influences gender hierarchies in other ways because women very scarcely get family packages, even when they have kids. And so, for instance, people like women who divorced, like most of the time they left Dubai because it was too complicated. Like, it's so expensive to live there with children. So for people that are parents, it definitely influences like the forms of families and so on. And the other group is what like the single residents. So single is just their migration status. Some of them are in couple, but they migrated as singles. They have no kids, they don't sponsor other people. And many of them came in Dubai without a job and they searched for a job locally. And some of them have very bad contracts. Some of them have not great salaries and so on. But what I saw is that so these people are, in general, they are younger. They are from very diverse backgrounds in terms of class and race. And some of them really make very quick careers. So they can begin with low salaries, but like in 5 years, they earn like 10 times their initial salary. So their privilege is to be able to first to come with an automatic visa and to be able to search for a job in the country, which would not be possible if they had no Western passport. And then, like, very often they are promoted very quickly, also because they have a Western passport and they represent skills, and like organizations use them also to build a certain image of the organization and so on. But they don't have the same privileged lifestyles than, you know, the expat men and so on. It's not the same. And a very important difference between them is that the men on expatriate contracts, they can leave Dubai very easily. But the single residents that are doing local careers, after a few years, they are like kind of stuck in Dubai. So it was very interesting for me to interview them after a few years, because many of them, like 1 or 2 years after arriving, had a very positive discourse about Dubai as very easy and very nice lifestyle, and having access to luxurious leisure spaces and so on, and security, and earning money and having responsibilities in your job and so on. And like 5 to 6 years afterwards, they were like, oh, I want to leave, but I don't know how to do, because if I leave, I'm afraid I want to find a job elsewhere. But I got tired of Dubai because, like, for instance, once you have health problems, it becomes very difficult. Some of them, they thought they could not afford having children in Dubai, for instance, so they did not have children, and they wanted to leave. So this is this kind of difference, I think. Also, a very important point I forgot to say is that the amount of salary conditions the fact that you can sponsor dependents. So it means that if you have a high salary, for instance, you can sponsor your children. But if you don't have a high salary, you cannot sponsor your children. So you cannot have visas for your children. So that's a very important point, and it also really shapes the families that you see in Dubai, and it's very expensive. Like, there is no public infrastructure for children. So like only relatively rich people can afford to, like among foreigners, can afford to bring up children in Dubai.
Okay, you brought this up where you were really distinguishing single people versus people who, you know, had families. And so I really liked your discussion of what you call the guest family, where basically there's like a visa that invites people to bring their families because it guarantees, like, the visa that they can get, basically, or the labor contract that they have is conducive to raising a family, because that labor contract comes with such a high salary. But in addition to that, it comes with, like, you know, a huge housing allowance, right? In a country where rent is not monthly but yearly, right? So to have a nice house, you actually really need this perk of a housing allowance, and then also that they get free tuition. And I think those are like the really big perks that then creates what you call the guest family. And so I thought that was like a really interesting, it's a really interesting illustration of states and markets coming together to show a gendered organization. So it was like a gendered organization of states and markets, right? And so that's very interesting, because most discussions of gendered organizations are either just about the state as a gendered organization, or the market as a gendered organization, or the workplace, let's say. But here you're showing how, like, states and markets come together in this space to create this sort of gendered organization of being a foreigner in this space. So what's interesting that anthropologists, not so much sociologists, get into this a lot. It's like exceptions to that pattern. Then it's like what happens, right? And so then are there women who are the main sponsors of the guest family visa, right? And what happens, and how are their households different from that typical white male who has that main visa to bring their family there? What happens to the guy versus, we hear a lot about what happens to the women, that they sacrifice their careers a lot, they keep busy, but they really don't sort of have the opportunity to get paid as much as they did. They get labeled, they get tagged as people who don't really need to work. And so workplaces don't really give them priority, right? It's something you talk about in your book. But I do wanna like ask also about the guest family, the white men with the dependent women. So I wanna give a little bit more context here. In this country, I mean, it is really like gender unequal in so many ways. So in this country, there's still coverture. Like the guy basically like owns the wife, right? So if you are in the UAE and you're married, the guy can actually take your name out of your bank account. The guy can like really, you know, you need permission. You can't leave the country without your husband's permission. I mean, it's really pretty intense, right? So if you have this sort of egalitarian relationship, it's great, right? But what if you have an abusive husband, right? What if, you know, the guy, I mean, it's really set up to control women. So I wanted to ask you about that, like how the state is also very gender repressive, and if Westerners ever had to confront that. One of the people that one of the employers that I interviewed actually in the UAE, she ran $1 million, like her company was worth $10 million. And she married a guy. And after she married the guy, who was not the one who started the company, he took her name out of like her bank account, right? I mean, there's ways around it where you can write sort of a contract in the free zone, but not everyone knows that. And so I just wanted to get a little more sense from you about these sort of extreme like gender inequality conditions, and how, if that ever became an issue in your, you know, in your study.
I mean, I completely agree with you. And like Dubai is also a very interesting case to think of security, because a lot of people I met, a lot of women, had a very idealized discourse about Dubai as being very secure and so on. And they talk about security in public space. And this is because public space is very much controlled, and like a lot of men are actually afraid of what could happen to them if they, yeah, so anyways. But at the same time, the private space is really out of public control, you know. So and like when it changed now, but when I did my research, relationships outside sex outside of marriage was still banned. So it meant that, for instance, like a woman who was, like a lot of women I met were actually living with their partners in heterosexual couples, but not married. So if they had a problem with them, it's for sure like they could not do anything with the police or with the state, because first of all, like it was illegal to live together. So they would have had problems, in fact. So it's this kind of things. But I was surprised because, I mean, a lot of women had a very idealized discourse about gender in Dubai. And I think it really shows also privilege, because for sure, I mean, they were like, oh, you know, Dubai is so good for women, and to do business, it's really much easier than in other contexts and so on. But they were really ignoring like the status of women low-paid positions and so on. So also this whole discourse on security, of course, it completely ignores what domestic employees experience and so on. Yes, they had not, I mean, some of them, like among the women who came as dependents of expatriate men, I think some found it very difficult to be legally dependent. And also, like, it's also that the job market did not offer them good jobs in general. So this was also an interesting discourse, because many of them did not work, also because the conditions in Dubai were not very advantageous for them. They didn't get high salaries and so on. And it also says something about how this job market constructs Western women. I mean, single Western women can make careers and so on, but women who have kids, no. I mean, it's not possible. They're really not. They don't have a high value on Dubai's job market. So it's interesting also about the imaginary of, I think, disponibility, availability, sexual availability of women and so on. I mean, I think it's significant. But sometimes they also had discourses like, I won't work for such a low salary. And I think it was also in contrast with their husband's salaries. But in fact, like other, like single women would have worked for these salaries. And I think there was also sometimes a racial distinction in this discourse, because, yeah, in the book, like, if you read the interviews, you can see that people very randomly rationalize amounts of salaries. Like some amounts of salaries are said to be like Filipino salaries and so on. So this is very present in what people say about salaries and so on. So there's also this willingness to not work for low salary that is interesting, both in terms of gender and in terms of race. But yes, to just come back to the question, I also think that the state is very gender oppressive, but most people did not, like most women did not really insist on this aspect. And I think the only one that really reported, like I had some discourses, but it was more a problem in terms of workers' rights, and especially migrant workers' rights and gender, you know. But so, for instance, it's very difficult to complain against your employer because of your dependence as a migrant worker, you know, on contracts, and like your visa depends on your employer. So so I had I think one of them told me about sexual harassment she could never do anything about because of this contract issue. And another one told me about becoming pregnant and being fired. And this happens a lot in Dubai, I think. So it's the same problem of articulation between the state and market and organizations, I think.
So I have more questions, but I think we're supposed to open this up to the audience Q&A. But congratulations on finishing this book. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So audience members, if you have questions, you can start putting in the Q&A. We can't see you with a hand raised, so you'll have to put your name in Q&A. So Rhacel, if you want to ask one more question while we get everyone going, that's great.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so one other tension. So you never really like talk about Orientalism, right? But it seems so prominent in. So these people enjoy Dubai. They love Dubai. They benefit from the rules of Dubai. But then the way they see themselves is also they have a very Orientalist perspective of the people around them, right? And like the Emiratis that have a higher status than them, and the global South people that have a lower status than them. And so I thought that was just sort of fascinating, like how it's kind of like this modern day colonialism going on in their heads about them as very progressive people, especially in relation, for example, to domestic workers. The way they really sort of, in your book, the way, you know, your interviewees were constructing sort of their moral dilemmas about domestic work. There was really this tone of Orientalism. And so I wanted you to say a little bit more about that.
Yes, I think about I mean, the discourse of the people I met was very ambivalent because they were both thinking a lot about Dubai's social structure. And, you know, very often they denounced it as very unfair and so on. And at the same time, like they really, I mean, I think they were really trying hard to justify their own positions, but without really recognizing their roles. And so in one chapter, I analyze women's discourse on their domestic employees. And all the paradoxes in this discourse, because it's, yeah, to say it very quickly, I mean, first, I mean, in general, they think that it's unfair to have a domestic employee. And so for them, it's something of the past and of Southern countries and of another, you know, so it does not really concern them. They're just, you know, witnessing it as residents in Dubai. But in fact, they are hiring domestic employees and like interacting with them like daily. And so they have several arguments to justify this, such as like, I had no choice. So it's the first argument. And so, yeah, it also brings us to the division of labor we talked about before and so on. Second argument is that they are saving these domestic employees, you know, because like Arab families are so rude and so like very nice Western families are actually like making these women's lives better. And like they're paying them more and so on. So it's this kind of discourse I've been working on. And also, I mean, a discourse I found really paradoxical is that many of them like enjoyed being in Dubai because of domestic employees taking care of their very young kids. But they saw that they would have to leave Dubai before their kids really understand what's going on, because they don't want their kids to understand, you know, like how this social order is unequal and so on. And they don't want their kids to have the habitus of kids who grow up with domestic employees. So this is a very paradoxical discourse, because the problem in the end is how their kids will become good, you know, Western subjects, and not like what's the lives of these domestic employees. So so yes, it's very rich to analyze, but
Great. Well, I have a question while we're waiting for our audience. I was really curious, Rhacel, again, thank you for joining us. I was curious how, when you were reading this book, having just gotten back from doing research in Dubai, like how does this kind of overlap with the book that you're working on that I think is coming out soon, right?
Yeah, no, reading this, I mean, it does give me like an interesting perspective on the employer. For me, this book represents like the experiences of people who are likely to employ domestic workers. And so the discussion on the moral dilemmas of hiring domestic workers is definitely one that agrees with my analysis, because in the book that I write about, I talk about like domestic work basically as a moral project, and that employers, really have different moral approaches to how they employ domestic workers. And one thing I do push against is this reduction of domestic work in the region as one of structural violence, or one that you can reduce to just the dependent visa, because employers, are very ambivalent about this power that they hold over this person. And the people who are ambivalent are not just Westerners, but also people from the global South and also Emiratis. They're also very ambivalent about this power that they have. And so my findings basically is that employers either dehumanize their domestic workers, so they abuse the hell out of them and take advantage of this visa, or they infantilize them because they see them as children, because these visas really are like kind of infantilize the domestic workers. And then there are those who resist this power inequality. So they really recognize the humanity of their domestic workers. And so many Westerners like to think of themselves as belonging in that third group.
No, that's really interesting. That's great. Let's see, audience, do we have any questions? I see Kimberly. Oh, you're muted, Kimberly.
I'll defer to folks in the audience. Is there anyone in the audience? I can also ask a question. It's kind of an odd, okay. Well, I mean, as I was reading your book, one of the things that just really struck me is there's a whole sort of literature on, like overseas immigrants going back to their home countries. And I'm thinking of, Leslie Wang's new book on Chinese Americans going back, and there's kind of a race dynamic there about escaping racism in Western countries and feeling like, you had these quotes about their husbands aren't going to be a target, and so there's sort of a race dimension there that I was hoping you can kind of expand more on, because in a way it's easy to kind of have a simple takeaway being that Dubai doesn't suffer from the same kinds of racial problems of the West, but I would imagine that they have their own sort of, intersections of race class hierarchies there. And I'm just wondering if you could expand a bit more, especially because if we put your work into conversation with Rhacel's work, I don't think it's just, visa or passport status that differentiates folks entering Dubai. There's got to be, it's presumably a racial dimension, because you have, Westerners with Western passports, but also Rhacel's group of people that are entering with particular visa status who are racialized in a very different way as migrant domestic workers. And so I'm just, I just want to put the two pieces in conversation while also being mindful of a literature that talks about, overseas Chinese or overseas Vietnamese returning to the home countries to escape kind of Western forms of racism.
Okay, I don't want to take up too much space here because I want Amélie to talk about her book, but I just want to first say that it would be a mistake to think that what Nadia Kim talks about, where you have this globalization of African Americanism going because of the colonial legacy of the US. Like, that's definitely not happening there. Like, I just want to say that. So I'm not sure if Amélie knows this, but I went to, about Emiratis. But I had the privilege of actually befriending a lot of Emiratis, and that's a long story of how I got into this very elusive community, which is, as Amélie will say, is just so hard to access them. But I was very fortunate that I went to so many of their households. And they're Black. Like, that's what my shock was when I went into their space. Because you see a lot of people wearing white robes. You actually don't know who's Emirati there. It could be like Yemeni, it could be like, you know, from someone from like Bahrain. But like the households I went to, I was so shocked that there were so many, like if you're going to go with colorism, very dark colored Emirati. And so that's something no one really talks about. No one knows, no one writes about it. But one of the legacies of, you know, after they found oil, and they nationalized in the early 70s, actually every single person who was physically there, including former slaves, suddenly became an Emirati. And by being an Emirati, they suddenly got all the state benefits that comes with being Emirati. And so then these benefits are like, if you marry an Emirati, you get a free house. Like you get like free everything. Like your kid gets into college, like in the US, they pay for it. Welfare is really kind of abundant. Of course, there's like poor Emiratis, and no one really knows who the poor Emiratis are. People think they're like the more nomadic people that became poor. And so, so as we talk about race, that's something I do want to, you know, actually like really push people to like move away from sort of this universality of a very Western slavery history narrative of race. That's like, that I found actually very, very different in the reality of the people there. I mean, there's a question too from one of the audience members, but Amélie, you want to add to this? People seem to be interested in race.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. I mean, again, it's complex in Dubai because what I found out, and especially among French people, because there are lots of French people of color in Dubai, in like with different backgrounds. Like most of them had a very idealized discourse on Dubai again, and especially about racism. Maybe except for, I mean, it was also very interesting to see how they appropriated the local racial categories and racial hierarchies. And I think, for instance, one of the interviewees who did not have this very idealized discourse about Dubai as more open to French people of color than France was like a French guy with a Bangladeshi background, and he really felt that like he had to, like he was really experiencing anti-Indian racism in Dubai, and it's a very central racism in Dubai. But of course, I mean, it's all about, it's a very complex articulation between race and class, because people have to be interpreted as Western, because if you are not interpreted as Western, then like you will definitely be treated very often like very badly, I think. So it really makes a difference. And so that's also why I worked on performances, self-performances of oneself as Western, because it's, I mean, all the people I talked with like told me, like some of them really had very specific strategies that they used to be always interpreted as a Western resident, you know. And I mean, this is even, I think, very explicitly advised to new residents. For instance, their organizations will tell them like you have to dress very well always, because it's very important that you are not mistaken as African or Indian, or you know. So it's I think it's really interesting to see how how some people yeah, there is this, cosmopolitan official discourse of Dubai's government that is also really, that also goes with like white supremacy in Dubai. So no, it's really complex, but definitely like there's something interesting happening in terms of like when you see the elites, the economic elites in Dubai is definitely very, very diverse. So, so yes, that's what I can say.
Can I add something to?
Go ahead.
Can I just add something to that? It's just like an anecdote, and it supports like what you were just saying, and it's a personal experience of mine. So I was in Dara, and I was getting a metro pass, and so the metro pass is like the card is I think 5 dirhams, and so I wanted like something like I wanted a 20 dirham pass. But they ended up not giving me a 20 dirham pass because they gave me a 15 dirham pass because it was like $5 for the ticket, for the actual card. Because I said I want 20 dirhams inside of it, but then no, they gave me 15 dirhams inside of it. I don't know why I wanted 20 dirhams inside of it and not 15, but I was like, no, I want 20, right? And the woman said, that's not. So I said, okay, just charge my card again. So add another 5 dirhams into that. And then the woman at the station said to me, that's not possible. So I responded, that's so stupid, right? Like, that's so stupid that I can't add another 5 dirhams into my card. So as soon as they said that, I got arrested, right? Because in Dubai, in the UAE, you cannot call someone stupid, you can't demean someone, you can't belittle them, right? It's like you can make a citizen's arrest. So then they took me to the police station. They were like, you are getting kind of fined or arrested for calling her stupid. And I was like, but I didn't call her stupid. I said, that's stupid, which is an American expression, right? But then they were like, give us your passport. I didn't have it. And then my husband was there and he's white. So I called him and he came with my passport. And as soon as they saw the US passport, like everything changed. So I think they thought I was like a Filipino migrant worker. And before the passport came, the Emirati woman arresting me said, you are like a, guest of this country. You should be nicer to your fellow Filipinos. Like you're all the same here, right? But then as soon as the passport came and they were like, oh, she's not like a migrant worker. They basically said, anyway, they let me go. But they had me write a testimony saying, I will never do this again. And so, of course, I'm like this little, a confident American. So I literally just wrote, I will never do this again. But then they asked the Filipino person that I offended if they wanted to charge me $750. I was like, oh, damn, I'm gonna have to pay $750. But then she's like, no, I will not charge her $750. And then she proceeds to lecture me, be kind to people. I was like, oh my God. But I was happy they didn't charge me, right? And if she charged me, I'd have to go to court, which would have been a pain, right? And then probably would have gotten deported, But anyway, the long story is I do feel that Western passport matters. Like, for me, like I really saw that, right? Like I saw that, like I think I would have been arrested for saying that's stupid. And my ability, like things I could do is wider. And so that's why I liked your book. I liked your inclusion of non-white Westerners in there because I could really relate to some of these sort of rights that we get more than sort of the real guests, which are the low wage, migrant workers from the global South.
So I'm not sure how this forum works in terms of whether people can ask questions. So I'll just, Christian Molina has a question. Do you want to unmute and ask your question? Or if you don't, I could ask it for you. Okay, maybe the forum isn't. All right, I will just ask. The question is, I'm sitting with something that was mentioned early on in the talk about police brutality from a Black American woman. Can you speak more on discourses related to the police?
Yes. For me, in my own interviews, the main things I got was women from different countries and different racial belongings saying that Dubai was more secure and that they really feel very secure in Dubai. And I mean, even when I was there, I could walk like at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, and I could see many women in the streets. So I think it's something that I have not really seen in many places. So that was an interesting point. And then I also like the discourse by Black women, US Black women living in Dubai. It's something I found on different blogs saying that about their experience in the Emirates and that they feel really safer in the Emirates because the police, like many people say, like there are rules, but the rules are very clear and the police won't target you because you are Black or because you are a Black man. I also heard this discourse among French Muslim men who said, like, you know, here the police, I mean, as long as you are obeying the rules and don't say like that's stupid to someone, you won't have problems with the police, and also they behave in a very good manner and so on. So there is this belief that is shared among Westerners, I think, and that actually does not also recognize their privileged situation in Dubai, because if there were again, like if there were domestic employees trying to flee their employer's house and without their passports, they would really be at risk with the police. If they like, so it's also because of this Western passport that everything is easier for them. And still, like a few people had problems with the police. So, for instance, if your employer does not renew your working visa and you don't know it, like it happened to someone I met, a US American, so it happened to her. She went to the airport and in fact, she didn't know it, but her employer had not renewed her visa. And so she was jailed. And she was lucky that she could keep her telephone and call for people and so on. So this kind of things happens. And very often that's the point when people stop idealizing Dubai, because I mean, they say, I still enjoy Dubai, but now I know that it's like the laws here are very strict and you can end up in jail without really understanding what happened. So
I want to follow up on that, because I think that more than like, you know, random police violence, you know, the police like racially profiling you, I think people's fear of authorities is really like when they slightly break that rule. So it's like everything is fine in Dubai if you're within the rules. But once you sort of stay away, like, you know, you just go a little bit out, you know, like public intoxication is one of them, right? So, and then I think the other big one is debt. And so you sort of hint about that in your book, where there's this pressure to really live up this like great life that you have to have in Dubai, but many people's salaries don't really allow them that. And so then they feel this pressure to spend more than how much they earn. And in Dubai, if you don't pay your credit cards, you get incarcerated, right? And so, you know, like I know in the Filipino community, what's interesting in who are incarcerated women in Dubai, like among Indonesians, it's domestic workers who tried to illegally abort their babies, and abortion is illegal there. And then the second group are like the Filipino women, and they're mostly middle-class women who couldn't pay for their credit card. But then there's also Western women in there also couldn't pay for their credit cards. And so I think the relationship with authority is sort of not really how we imagine it in this country, you know, or in France. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about the negotiation of debt and when they sort of cross that line that they risk incarceration because they couldn't pay for their debt. And that's why they say, you know, the stereotype is like, you see super nice cars that have been abandoned in the airport in Dubai. And these are the people whose businesses folded, they couldn't pay for their debt. And so to avoid incarceration, they just flee and leave everything behind.
I think we have another question in the chat from Ilkwa Lufti. Amélie, can you say more about the theme of intimacy and how that plays out in your work?
Intimacy was a way for me to talk about relations that that people have and the ways in which their representation and practice of relations are central in constructing their distinctive Western subjectivities. And so I chose the word intimacy because I wanted to talk about things that encompass sexuality but go beyond. So it's like, for instance, relations of marriage and having kids and so on, with whom do you live and so on. But also, yes, so who lives with whom, for instance, and what kind of relation you have with your domestic employee, how you create distance with somebody who lives with you, how you create, like for instance, who do you see as your possible friends, who do you see as your possible lovers, and so on. So this is a way to speak about, yes, the relations, also the affects, because the affects are central in, like, for instance, judging that somebody could be a friend or a lover or not. And you had a lot of racialized discourses about it. And there it's very central, the articulation between race and class. Because, for instance, among single Westerners, many were in couples with people, like there were a lot of interracial couples, but it was either Western passport holders or people with the same kind of job and salary and so on. But like other categories, such as, you know, like for instance, waiters, were people with whom you, like Westerners, Western single residents said that they could never become friends and they had nothing in common and so on. So this is this kind of discourse also that is interesting to study. Also, like the projections of oneself, like a lot of them had said, for instance, I'm having so much fun in Dubai and so on, but it's, you know, it's, for me, it's also very superficial. It's not going to last forever. This is not where I want to have a family and so on. So this is also very, yeah, it also reveals, you know, the Orientalist representations of Dubai as a superficial space and so on, and very heteronormative constructions of what a serious relation is, these kind of things that I could analyze through this concept of intimacy.
We've been joined by my favorite timekeeper. Evelyn has joined us to remind us of our time, so I appreciate that. I just want to thank everybody for being here. And if you are joining us from the University of Chicago, Amélie is here for the entire month of October. So if you enjoyed the conversation, if you have other comments, I really encourage you to reach out. And Amélie has an office over at Gender Studies, so you could come by and say hello. Rhacel, when is your new book going to come out?
October 12th.
Oh my gosh,
Wow.
October 12th, right around the corner. Okay, that's amazing. And Kimberly, when is your new book coming out?
Sorry, this is kind of a hard hour. I tried to make it for as long as I could without getting her. Spring 2022. I'm not sure the exact month.
And it's Spiderweb Capitalism.
How global elites exploit frontier markets.
How global elites exploit frontier markets. So thank you all for joining us. This is really fantastic. I love seeing sociologists at the beginning of the quarter. Thank you so much. This is great.
Well,
And
congratulations again on your book.
Yes, congratulations. And I hope we can have coffee sometime.
great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone. And thank you, Tate, so
Bye.
much. Bye.